Question number 3, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change, Suzanne Reeds. Will he take a more ambitious climate target to Paris than the current target in light of new evidence showing that, quote, only the most ambitious effort to curb emissions will stop Antarctica's ice shelves from collapsing, end quote?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
No, we will not, because there are going to be 5 years of negotiation after Paris to determine the detailed rules which are extremely important to New Zealand. We will not be changing our INDC and converting it into an NDC until we know what the deal is.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does the Minister accept that if every other country matched New Zealand's emissions reduction target, the result would be 3 to 4 degrees of warming?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Tim Groser.
Another example of throwing numbers around without context. The reality is this. Since 80% of the emissions in the upper troposphere are carbon dioxide, and since they are by far the most lethally dangerous, they stay around in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and since they are derived overwhelmingly from the production of energy, if the rest of the world adopted New Zealand's renewable electricity figure of 80%, the problem would be solved on a global level.
Supplementary question? Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, given that somewhat obfuscatory answer, is the Minister saying...
Order. Order. I invite the member to continue his question.
That he is prepared to freeload on other countries' emissions reductions, even though New Zealand has also agreed not to allow more than 2 degrees of warming?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
I'm not absolutely sure that I understand the question, but we will take a position in Paris that is absolutely fair and reasonable and contribute to the conference in many other ways than just a number on a piece of paper.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Given that the combined pledges of the world's governments currently lock the planet into 3 degrees of warming, at which point Antarctica's ice shelves will collapse, why will the Minister not show some real leadership and increase New Zealand's target?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
We've been watching the Green Party in recent days on this Antarctic issue. What has happened is that a New Zealand climate change scientist has come out with a study which my science advisors tell me is consistent with the IPCC Working Party 1, which is the institution that provides the collective science for the world. And there is no inconsistency in this report. I can elaborate further on this issue, but what strikes me as extraordinary is it takes this finding, which says that it is likely that sea levels will rise between 28 centimetres and 98 centimetres, and then adds on the top of this a headline saying the government plans to melt Antarctica. And when you think about what is the idiot position that they've just put themselves into over TPP, you have to ask yourself whether the Green Party ever worries about its plausibility.
Order. The Minister now wandering from the answer. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So is the Minister aware, given how closely he has been watching the Green Party in recent days, that the Science magazine report states that losing the Antarctic ice shelves could mean, in 30 years, that New Zealanders will every fortnight experience floods as devastating as those that hit Wellington and Whanganui earlier this year?
The Honourable Tim Groser.
The IPCC scientists tell us that, including their predictions of what will happen on the Antarctic ice sheets, that it will rise between 28 centimetres, roughly what happened in the previous 100 years, and 98. They say if more dramatic action occurred on the Antarctic ice shelf, it could have the effect of increasing that by a few tenths of a metre. Well, a tenth of a metre is 10 centimetres, so a few, I don't know what they mean precisely, presumably less than 50, so it could be between 48 and 1.2 metres. That is the basis of the science. There is nothing new in this whatsoever.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So is the Minister therefore saying that the report in Science magazine, underpinned, as he said, by the IPCC report, says that although the sea level rise itself may be a mere 10 centimetres, that does not mean that we will see flash flooding and extreme weather events?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Tim
No,
Groser.
that is not my view. My view is actually consistent with the substance of the member's question. And New Zealand does need to prepare better for a higher number of extreme weather events. So in that sense, the answer is I agree with the underlying point the member is making.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So to recap, does the Minister agree that if every country had a target for emissions reductions as low as ours, then not only could we lose Antarctica, but also the Pacific Islands, New Zealand's coastal communities, global food supplies and more?
The
Mr.
Honourable
Speaker,
Tim Groser.
No, I do not agree.
Boss. Question number 4.
Thank you.
Carmel Sepuloni.
To the Minister of Social Development, what percentage of cancer patients receiving benefits